The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over Lincoln High as the students piled into the aging school bus parked in front of the ivy-covered brick building. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the residual excitement of the day's field trip to the historical sites dotting the countryside, a rare outing that had been both educational and thrilling. Mr. Harrow, a middle-aged history teacher with a passion for tales of yore, checked off each student's name with a practiced hand. His glasses slipped slightly down his nose as he peered over them, making sure no one was missing. Satisfied that all were accounted for, he clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, everyone, let's settle down," he said in a voice that was both firm and friendly. "We have a long ride ahead, and I expect each of you to respect the rules of this bus. No shouting, no switching seats while in motion, and please, keep the aisles clear." His tone softened as he finished the roll call, and he allowed himself a small smile. "Let's make this a smooth ride home." The students, a mix of sophomores and juniors, found their favorite spots. Lucas, a thoughtful junior with a keen interest in photography, chose a window seat towards the back. He liked to capture the changing landscapes as they traveled. Beside him, Mia, a sophomore with a rebellious streak and a sharp wit, was already pulling out her headphones, ready to lose herself in music. As the bus pulled away from the curb, the chatter resumed. Students discussed their favorite parts of the trip, the medieval castle they had toured, and the ghost stories Mr. Harrow had shared, his voice mingling with the creaks and groans of the old castle halls. Outside, the streets of their small town passed by in a familiar blur. Shops closed up for the night, and the few pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, eager to get home. The bus made its way onto the highway, the buildings giving way to open fields and pastures. The sky, a canvas of deep blues and purples, stretched over them, vast and unending. Lucas snapped pictures of the sunset, the colors vibrant against the darkening sky. He turned to Mia, showing her a particularly striking photo of the horizon. "That's beautiful," Mia admitted, her eyes reflecting the myriad of colors. "You really have a gift, Lucas." He shrugged modestly. "Just trying to capture the moment," he said, tucking his camera away. The laughter and conversations continued as the landscape grew more rugged and the towns farther apart. The road became a narrow strip of asphalt, winding its way through increasingly barren terrain. Twilight deepened into night, and the bus's headlights cut through the darkness, the only light for miles. Suddenly, the bus lurched, a loud bang echoing through the cabin. Conversations halted as the bus coasted to a shuddering stop. The engine went silent, leaving only the sound of 30 breaths drawn in unison. Mr. Harrow stood and moved down the aisle with a calm he didn't feel. "Stay seated, everyone. Let me check what's happened." He made his way to the front, where the driver, a grizzled man named Carl, was already popping the hood latch. "What do you think it is?" Mr. Harrow asked, peering into the darkness outside. "Not sure yet," Carl replied, his voice grim. "Might be the engine overheated, or something worse. I'll know more in a minute." Back in the bus, the initial shock gave way to a buzz of nervous energy. Lucas turned his camera on again, documenting the unexpected turn of events, while Mia leaned over to speak to him. "Think we'll be stuck here long?" she asked, her voice a mix of anxiety and excitement. "I hope not," Lucas replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But it looks pretty serious." Outside, Carl's flashlight beam danced over the bus's innards, the light flickering as he inspected each component. Mr. Harrow watched, concern etching deeper lines into his already lined face. He turned back to the students, forcing a smile. "Don't worry, folks," he called out. "We'll be back on the road in no time." But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and the desert grew colder and more foreboding under the starlit sky, the stranded bus and its occupants began to realize that their journey home would be anything but ordinary. The tension inside the bus had grown palpable as the engine's initial coughs and sputters transformed into a complete, unsettling silence. The once vibrant chatter among the students gradually subsided, leaving an anxious stillness that seemed to mirror the empty expanse of the desert surrounding them. Carl, the bus driver, his face illuminated only by the narrow beam of his flashlight, wiped the sweat from his brow with a greasy handkerchief. He had been fumbling under the hood for nearly 20 minutes now, his muttered curses occasionally reaching the ears of those sitting nearest to the bus's front. Mr. Harrow stood beside him, trying to appear composed as he watched the futile attempts to revive the bus. "Any luck, Carl?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of concern. Shaking his head, Carl straightened up and slammed the hood down with more force than necessary. "It's no use," he declared, his voice grim. "The engine's overheated badly, and it looks like the radiator's busted. We're not going anywhere tonight without a tow." Mr. Harrow nodded, processing the gravity of their situation. He turned to face the worried faces peering at him from behind the rows of seats. "All right, everyone," he began, projecting his voice to reach the back of the bus. "It looks like we're in for a bit of a wait. I've just spoken with Carl, and unfortunately, the bus won't be moving anytime soon. We need to stay put and wait for help to arrive." The news was met with a mix of groans and nervous glances. Mr. Harrow continued, "I know it's not ideal, but we need to make the best of it. Please, remain calm and stay in your seats. It's safest inside the bus." Lucas turned to Mia, who was frowning at her phone. "No signal," she said, holding it up for him to see the lack of service bars. "That figures," Lucas replied, peering out the window into the dark. "We must be in one of those dead zones, completely cut off." Mr. Harrow, overhearing their conversation, added, "That's right. We're quite isolated out here. But I've managed to send a message to the school when we first broke down. They know where we are and will send help." The reassurance did little to ease the growing anxiety. Whispers began to ripple through the bus as students speculated about how long they might be stranded and what might be lurking in the dark expanse outside their windows. As the initial shock wore off, Mr. Harrow encouraged everyone to settle in as comfortably as possible. "We'll likely be here for a few hours. Let's stay positive and keep each other company. Does anyone have any games or stories to pass the time?" A few students nodded, pulling out card games and beginning to gather into small groups. The light-hearted distractions were welcome, but the smiles were tense, the laughter a bit too loud. Outside, the desert night was alive with sounds unfamiliar and unsettling. The occasional rustle of wind-blown sand against the bus, or the distant howl of what could only be a coyote, served as stark reminders of their vulnerability. Lucas, unable to sit still, continued to snap pictures, though now his subjects were the worried faces of his classmates and the eerie landscape outside. Mia watched him work, her anxiety momentarily forgotten in the face of his calm focus. "Hey, at least you'll have a great photo essay on survival," she tried to joke, forcing a smile. "Yeah, stranded, night in the desert. It has a nice ring to it," Lucas replied, managing a weak chuckle. Their attempt at levity was interrupted by another sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed too close for comfort. The bus fell silent in an instant, every student straining to hear more. "Probably just the wind," Mr. Harrow said after a tense moment, not entirely convinced of his own words. He moved towards the driver's seat to speak with Carl. "Keep the doors locked and the emergency lights on," he instructed quietly. As he walked back down the aisle to reassure the students, the interior lights flickered briefly, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the worried faces. The reality of their situation settled deeper. They were stuck, far from help, surrounded by the unknown. The hours stretched on, each minute seeming longer than the last. Mr. Harrow paced the aisle, offering words of comfort, checking his watch frequently, and peering out the windows into the darkness that enveloped the stranded bus and its uneasy occupants. As the night deepened, a chill crept into the air, seeping through the thin metal walls of the bus. Students huddled together for warmth under the dim overhead lights, their earlier games and laughter replaced by an uneasy silence. The desert, a vast expanse of darkness punctuated only by the occasional eerie howl of a distant creature, seemed to press in against the windows with palpable force. Lucas, still restless, moved from his seat and wandered down the aisle, camera in hand. He paused at each window, peering into the blackness, hoping to capture some element of the night that felt so charged with tension. Mia, who had been watching him intently, decided to join him. "Seeing anything interesting?" Mia asked, trying to keep her voice light, but her words were tinged with unease. "Nothing yet. Just darkness and more darkness," Lucas replied, his voice low. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging up a small circle on the surface. Suddenly, Mia tensed, her arm shooting out to grip Lucas's shoulder. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her eyes wide as she stared out into the night. Lucas looked in the direction she was pointing. At first, he saw nothing but the inky landscape. Then, something moved, a swift, shadowy figure that darted from one patch of darkness to another, barely discernible but definitely there. "What was that?" Lucas murmured, his voice barely a breath as he adjusted his camera settings, hoping to catch whatever it was on film. "I don't know, but it was fast," Mia replied, her voice shaky. "Do you think it was an animal?" Before Lucas could answer, a loud bang sounded against the side of the bus, causing several students to scream. Mr. Harrow, who had been speaking quietly with Carl at the front, spun around sharply. "Everyone, stay calm," he called out, his voice struggling to mask his concern. "It's probably just a large animal curious about the bus. Stay inside and try to remain quiet." His words did little to soothe the nerves of the students. Whispers filled the bus as they speculated about what kind of animal could make such a noise and whether it could be dangerous. Lucas and Mia retreated from the window, joining the others in the center of the bus. Lucas kept his camera ready, while Mia scanned the faces of their classmates, seeing her own fear reflected back at her. The bus remained eerily silent, save for the soft murmur of frightened students and the occasional creak of its settling frame. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, another noise shattered the silence, a scraping sound, like claws on metal, that seemed to travel along the side of the bus from back to front. A collective gasp rose from the students, and several backed away from the sides of the bus, their eyes wide with terror. Mr. Harrow, trying to maintain some semblance of control, moved towards the sound, his own fear masked by a determined look. "It's okay, probably just trying to figure out what we are," he reassured them, though his voice faltered. Suddenly, the entire bus shook as if something large had thrown itself against it. Students screamed, clutching one another, their faces pale in the flickering light. Mr. Harrow braced himself against a seat, looking around frantically for any sign of what could be causing the disturbance. Lucas, despite his fear, raised his camera, his hands trembling as he aimed it at the window. The lens focused just in time to capture a fleeting image, a grotesque, twisted form with glowing eyes that stared right into the bus before disappearing into the darkness. The image on the camera's display was blurry and indistinct, but it was enough to confirm that they were not dealing with any ordinary animal. Panic ensued as the reality of their predicament became undeniable. "We need to stay together and keep quiet," Mr. Harrow said, trying to sound authoritative as he moved back to his position near the driver. "Help will come. We just need to stay calm and wait it out." But as the night wore on, with intermittent sounds and unsettling movements surrounding the bus, it became increasingly difficult for anyone to heed his advice. The students were trapped, isolated in the heart of a desert with something unknown and menacing lurking just beyond the thin safety of the bus walls. Fear settled over them like a dense fog, every sound from outside a reminder of their vulnerability in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The night seemed to stretch into an endless tunnel of terror as the creature outside grew bolder with each passing hour. The bus, once a noisy hub of student life, had transformed into a silent vault, locking in 30 terrified souls. Lucas clutched his camera like a lifeline, his knuckles white from the grip. He tried to stay focused on capturing whatever he could, believing somehow that if he could just photograph the creature clearly, it would all become more manageable, less nightmarish. Mia sat close beside him, her eyes darting nervously from the windows to the aisle and back again. Outside, the sounds had escalated from curious scratching to aggressive thumping. It was as if the creature was testing the bus, looking for a weak spot to exploit. A low, guttural growl resonated through the thin metal walls, each snarl sending shivers down the spines of everyone inside. Mr. Harrow stood near the front of the bus, speaking in hushed tones into his phone, trying again to reach emergency services. The signal was weak, the voice on the other end breaking into static. "We need help immediately." "There's something out here," he tried to explain, but the call dropped, leaving them more isolated than before. The students whispered among themselves, their voices a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What is that thing?" one of the younger students, a sophomore named Derek, asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but it doesn't sound like any animal I've ever heard of," another replied, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if the gesture alone could protect her. Suddenly, the bus lurched violently as a heavy weight slammed against it, causing everyone inside to stumble and grab for hold. A piercing shriek echoed through the bus, not from the creature, but from a terrified student near the back. The window beside her had cracked, a web of fine lines spreading across the glass from the impact. "Everyone get away from the windows!" Mr. Harrow shouted, regaining his balance. "Move to the center aisles, now!" The students scrambled, some crying, others too shocked to make a sound, as they huddled together in the center of the bus. Lucas and Mia moved with them, but Lucas kept his camera pointed towards the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of their assailant. The creature seemed to circle the bus, its presence marked by the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps and the occasional thud against the bus's exterior. Every so often, the headlights caught fragments of a form, too quick to fully register, a horrifying blend of shadows and fleeting light. As the attacks continued, a sense of desperation overtook Mr. Harrow. He knew they couldn't just wait it out, they had to do something. "Carl, do you have any flares or anything we could use to scare it off?" he asked the driver, who was now gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Carl nodded, his face set in grim determination. "Got a couple of road flares in the back. Might do the trick to spook whatever that is." "Good, get them ready, but don't open the doors until we have a plan," Mr. Harrow instructed, turning back to address the students. "We're going to try and scare it off. I need everyone to stay calm and quiet. No sudden movements." Carl retrieved the flares, and Mr. Harrow took them, weighing them in his hands like the last pieces of hope they might be. His plan was simple: light the flares and throw them away from the bus, hoping the bright light and smoke would deter the creature. With every student's eye on him, Mr. Harrow cracked open the emergency exit door just enough to toss the flares outside. The night air rushed in, carrying with it the pungent odor of the desert, dry and ancient. He struck the flares, their sparks briefly illuminating his determined expression, and threw them into the darkness. The flares arced through the air, landing several yards away from the bus. They sputtered and flared to life, casting a harsh red glow across the sand and scrub. The effect was immediate and eerie. Shadows danced wildly around the bus, and for a moment, the creature's growls ceased. Silence enveloped the bus once more, but it was a tense silence, filled with anticipation. Every student held their breath, watching the flickering light of the flares dimming in the distance. Would the creature be driven away, or had they only angered it further? As the last of the light from the flare died out, the desert fell back into impenetrable darkness, and the wait began anew. The unknown creature, hidden once again by night's embrace, left the students trembling, wondering if the siege was over, or if it had only just begun. The brief respite afforded by the flares had passed, and a palpable dread settled back over the bus as the students stared into the consuming darkness. The silence was thicker than before, heavy with the weight of their collective fear. No one spoke, even breaths were held, as if the mere act of breathing might draw the creature's attention. Lucas, camera still in hand, had not stopped watching through the window, despite Mr. Harrow's earlier warnings. Beside him, Mia shifted nervously, her gaze fixed on the eerie play of shadows just beyond the glass. Her earlier bravado had dissolved entirely, replaced by a tense vigilance. "Lucas, maybe you should sit down," she whispered, her voice a strained thread of sound. "It's not safe." Lucas barely nodded, his attention split between Mia's concerned face and the lens of his camera. "Just a little longer," he murmured back. "I think I might see." He was cut off as the bus shook violently again, more aggressively than before. A loud, metallic groan echoed as the side of the bus dented inward from another forceful blow. This time, the creature seemed to be throwing its full weight against their only refuge. Screams erupted inside the bus as students clung to each other. Mr. Harrow rushed to Lucas and Mia, pulling them back from the window just as the glass spiderwebbed with cracks. The sound was deafening, a sharp, terrifying splintering that filled the bus with the fear of imminent breach. "Everyone get down," Mr. Harrow ordered, pushing Lucas and Mia toward the floor. "Stay away from the windows." The students obeyed, some crying, others praying aloud as they cowered under the seats. The lights flickered ominously, casting everyone into near-total darkness interspersed with brief, haunting flashes of light. In the chaos, Mia's hand slipped from Lucas's grip. He reached out to grab her again, but in a heart-stopping moment, one of the windows shattered completely, showering the interior with shards of glass. A grotesque, twisted limb, covered in mottled skin and ending in taloned fingers, thrust through the broken window. Before anyone could react, the creature's hand clamped around Mia's arm. Her scream was piercing as it began to pull her toward the shattered window. Lucas lunged forward, grabbing her other hand, trying desperately to pull her back. "Mia!" Lucas shouted, his voice raw with panic. He braced his feet against the seat, pulling with all his strength, but the creature's pull was monstrously strong. Mr. Harrow and several other students joined Lucas, grabbing onto Mia, forming a human chain. Their combined efforts seemed futile against the creature's horrifying strength. Mia's face was a mask of terror, her eyes wide as she screamed for help. The tug-of-war lasted only seconds, but each moment stretched out torturously. With a final, powerful yank, the creature overpowered them. Mia's fingers slipped from Lucas's grasp, and she was dragged out of the bus, her screams echoing into the night as she disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the bus's emergency lights. The creature's growls faded into the distance, mingling with Mia's fading screams, leaving a silence that was louder than any of the sounds that had preceded it. Lucas was left kneeling by the broken window, his hands bleeding from the glass cuts, his breaths coming in ragged sobs. Mr. Harrow pulled him back, away from the gaping hole where the window once was, his own face pale and shaken. "We need to block the window," Mr. Harrow said, his voice trembling as he turned to address the remaining students, who were staring in shock and horror. "Use anything, backpacks, jackets, whatever you can find. We can't let it get back in." The students moved mechanically, numbed by shock, to barricade the window. They piled their belongings against the opening, stacking them as high as they could. As they worked, the harsh reality of their situation settled deeper into Lucas's mind. Mia, vibrant and rebellious, had been taken right before his eyes. Guilt and horror gnawed at him. He should have pulled harder, should have saved her. But deep down, he knew the truth. It had been beyond his, or anyone's, power to stop the creature. The bus, once a place of safety, now felt like a fragile shell, easily shattered. Each creak and rustle of wind against the improvised barricade sent waves of fear through the huddled students, leaving them to wonder who might be next. The night loomed longer and darker than ever, with the threat of the creature's return hanging over them like a malevolent shadow. The shock of Mia's abduction reverberated through the cramped confines of the bus, leaving an icy blanket of fear draped over the survivors. Lucas sat back against the cold metal of the bus floor, his face a pale mask of shock, hands trembling visibly. The makeshift barricade of backpacks and coats looked pathetically inadequate, a thin line of defense against whatever horrors lurked just beyond the shattered window. Mr. Harrow moved among the students, his demeanor one of forced calm as he checked on each one, offering a hand on the shoulder or a few soothing words. Yet his eyes betrayed his concern, darting continuously towards the barricaded window, as if expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. "Listen to me, all of you," Mr. Harrow finally announced, his voice carrying a firmness he was far from feeling. "We need to stay together and stay strong. Help will come. We just need to endure until it does." Carl, the bus driver, joined Mr. Harrow at the front of the bus, his face grim. "We need to secure the bus better. If it got in once, it might try again. We should check all the windows and doors, reinforce them with whatever we have." Lucas, hearing this, pushed himself up from the floor. The image of Mia's terrified face as she was dragged away haunted him, spurring him into action. He couldn't just sit and wait. Moving with a newfound purpose, he joined Carl and Mr. Harrow in inspecting the bus. Together, they moved through the aisles, examining each window. The other students, sparked by their initiative, began to follow suit. Some used belts to tie the emergency exit handles together, while others moved seats to block the less stable windows. Derek, a tech-savvy sophomore, dug through his backpack and pulled out a small toolkit. "I can try to reinforce the door hinges," he offered, his voice steady despite the evident fear in his eyes. "That's a great idea, Derek." "Thank you," Mr. Harrow responded, grateful for the boy's courage. They watched as Derek set to work, tightening screws and reinforcing the doorframe with strips of metal taken from his kit. As they worked, the students began to talk, their voices low but steady. They shared what they knew about survival, bits and pieces picked up from movies, books, and the occasional wilderness program. It wasn't much, but it helped fill the silence and keep the edge of panic at bay. Lucas returned to the front of the bus, where he had left his camera. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the device. The memory card held the last images of Mia before she was taken, and part of him dreaded the thought of looking at them. Yet, he knew that documenting everything was important, perhaps even crucial if they were to understand what was happening. He picked up the camera and started reviewing the photos, his thumb pausing on the image of the creature. It was blurred and indistinct, but distinctly non-human. Its limbs were elongated, its eyes a reflective, haunting glow. As he stared at the image, a cold realization washed over him. They weren't just dealing with a wild animal. This was something else, something far more sinister. "Lucas, are you all right?" Mr. Harrow's voice broke his trance. Lucas looked up, his eyes haunted. "I got a picture of it," he said quietly, handing the camera over to Mr. Harrow. The history teacher examined the photo closely, his brow furrowed. "This is... I don't even know what this is," he admitted, handing the camera back. "But we should keep it safe. It might be important later." As the night wore on, the students managed to reinforce the bus to the best of their abilities. They sat back, exhausted and on edge, surrounded by the makeshift fortifications that gave them a semblance of security. Outside, the desert remained eerily quiet, the silence a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Every creak of the bus, every whisper of wind against the metal sides, sent shivers down their spines. They were trapped in a bubble of frail safety, waiting for dawn, for rescue, for any sign that the nightmare surrounding them was coming to an end. But as the hours ticked by, one question lingered in the back of their minds, unspoken but ever-present: would help arrive in time, or would the creature return to claim another? The uncertainty was crippling, but they had no choice but to wait, watch, and hope. The night pressed on, heavy and silent, a thick blanket of darkness enveloping the stranded bus. Inside, the tension was palpable, the air thick with the breaths of frightened students, their eyes wide in the dim light. Mr. Harrow paced the narrow aisle, his steps deliberate, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. Carl, sitting by the driver's seat, kept glancing through the windshield, his expression grim. The darkness outside seemed complete, a void that swallowed up any hope of seeing beyond the bus's immediate vicinity. Yet, every shadow, every rustle of wind stirred a fresh wave of anxiety among the passengers. Mr. Harrow stopped his pacing and stood decisively. "I need to do something more proactive," he announced, more to himself than to anyone else. His gaze swept over the students, their young faces marked by fear and exhaustion. He couldn't just sit and wait, he felt a responsibility, not just to protect, but to act. "Carl, I need your help," Mr. Harrow said, pulling the driver aside. "I have an idea, but it's risky. I want to create a diversion, something to lead whatever is out there away from the bus." Carl nodded, understanding the gravity of the plan. "What do you need me to do?" Mr. Harrow explained quickly, his voice low. "I'm going to take a flare and head out there. If I can draw it away, maybe it will give us a chance to get a signal out or, at the very least, some breathing room." "Are you sure about this, Harrow?" Carl asked, his voice tinged with concern. "It's dangerous to go out alone." "I know, but we can't wait here like sitting ducks." "We need to do something," Mr. Harrow insisted. He turned to address the rest of the bus. "I'm going out to draw it away. I want everyone to stay quiet and keep down. Carl will lock the door behind me and won't open it until I get back, understood? A murmur of nervous agreement swept through the bus, many students nodding, though their faces showed clear signs of worry for their teacher. Lucas approached Mr. Harrow as he prepared to leave. "Let me come with you," he said, determination in his voice despite the visible shaking of his hands. "No, Lucas, I need you here to help Carl keep everyone calm." "You've been brave enough already," Mr. Harrow replied, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a flare, Mr. Harrow nodded to Carl, who reluctantly opened the door. A gust of cold desert air swept into the bus, carrying with it the faint, musky odor of the desert night. Mr. Harrow stepped out, the door closing behind him with a thud that sounded like a finality. Outside, the darkness was oppressive, the silence broken only by his own steady breathing and the soft crunch of sand under his shoes. He walked a few paces away from the bus, his heart pounding in his chest, every shadow a potential hiding spot for the creature. After putting some distance between himself and the bus, Mr. Harrow stopped and lit the flare. The sudden bright light was blinding, casting long, dancing shadows across the desert floor. He waved the flare, making wide, sweeping gestures, hoping to catch the creature's attention. Back on the bus, Lucas and the other students watched through the windows, their breaths held, their bodies tense. The bright light from the flare cast a reddish glow, illuminating Mr. Harrow's lone figure against the vast darkness. Minutes passed, each one stretching out eternally. Mr. Harrow continued his waving, moving slowly but deliberately away from the bus. Then, without warning, a low growl echoed through the night, a sound so primal and terrifying it seemed to freeze the blood in his veins. The growl grew louder, closer. Mr. Harrow kept moving, his back to the bus, leading the unseen threat away from the students. His mind was clear, focused only on his task, even as fear gripped his heart. Suddenly, the growl turned into a roar, and the sound of heavy, thudding footsteps approached. Mr. Harrow didn't dare look back, he knew that to turn around would be to face terror itself. He pressed on, the flare held high, a beacon in the dark, a beacon of hope, and perhaps a beacon of sacrifice. Back on the bus, the students watched in horror and awe as their teacher disappeared into the darkness, his light a fading star against the overwhelming night. Their fear for him was immense, but so was their admiration for his bravery. Now, they waited, the silence returning, heavier than before, filled with the weight of unknown outcomes and the echoing steps of their protector walking into the dark. Inside the bus, the atmosphere had turned palpably solemn as the door shut behind Mr. Harrow. Lucas, standing near the front, stared out into the darkness where their teacher had vanished, his hands pressed against the cold glass, his breath fogging up the surface. The students huddled together, whispering anxiously among themselves. The fear was almost tangible, a living entity in itself, as they strained their eyes to follow the dim glow of the flare, now just a distant speck in the vast desert night. Carl, with a steadiness that belied his own racing heart, took charge in Mr. Harrow's absence. "We need to stay focused and keep quiet," he murmured to the students. "Keep away from the windows and doors. We don't know if it will come back." His words, intended to comfort, only served to heighten the tension, as every student seemed to hold their breath, listening for any sound other than that of their own heartbeats. The minutes stretched into hours, each passing moment an eternity. The students shared nervous glances, the younger ones clutching their seats or each other, trying to find comfort in the closeness. The older students, like Lucas, felt a sense of responsibility, their eyes scanning the dark, watching over their peers. Lucas, unable to sit still any longer, moved from his spot at the window and began pacing the aisle. He stopped beside a group of younger students, his voice low and soothing. "It's going to be okay," he reassured them, though his eyes kept darting to the bus door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Across from him, a girl named Sophie clung to her friend's hand, her eyes wide and filled with unshed tears. "What if he doesn't come back?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to believe he will," Lucas replied, though the uncertainty in his voice was clear. He couldn't shake the image of Mr. Harrow, a solitary figure against the sprawling darkness, his fate unknown. As the night dragged on, Derek, the tech-savvy sophomore, tried to distract the others by quietly discussing plans for when help would eventually arrive. "We'll need to tell them everything," he said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Every detail might help them understand what's out there." His words sparked a small flame of purpose among some of the students, who began recounting their experiences. Lucas listened, nodding occasionally, his mind racing with every account of the strange noises and movements outside. It wasn't just their imaginations, something inexplicable and terrifying was indeed stalking them. Without warning, the bus lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the students' faces. A collective gasp rose from the group as the lights stabilized, the brief interruption reminding them of their vulnerability. Carl stood by the driver's seat, his hand on the radio, which crackled intermittently with static. He was trying to reach out, to anyone, his voice a constant murmur as he repeated their location and situation. "This is Bus 27, stranded on Route 19. We need immediate assistance." His calls seemed to disappear into the void, unanswered. The stress and strain of the night were visible on every face, eyes were red and puffy from tears, faces pale from the cold and fear. Lucas found himself thinking of Mia, of Mr. Harrow, their faces etched deeply into his mind as symbols of the nightmare they had all endured. Then, amidst the soft murmur of voices and the hum of the idling bus engine, a faint sound caught Lucas's ear. It was distant at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it grew steadily, a mechanical hum, the sound of an approaching vehicle. Lucas's heart leapt. "Listen," he exclaimed, rushing to the window. "Do you hear that? It sounds like..." The other students lifted their heads, listening intently. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a clear indication of an approaching vehicle. Relief washed over some faces, a glimmer of hope in the endless night. But the question remained, was it rescue, or something else? The bus remained a small island of light in a sea of darkness, waiting for dawn, for rescue, for any sign that the ordeal might soon be over. The approaching sounds promised change, but whether for better or for worse, none could say. As the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder and clearer, a wave of tentative hope washed over the students on the bus. Lucas, pressed against the cold glass of the window, squinted into the dark, trying to discern any details in the still opaque desert night. The headlights of a vehicle cut through the darkness, drawing closer, its engines hum a soothing sound after hours of oppressive silence and fear. "Someone's coming," he shouted, a mix of relief and anxiety in his voice. The students stirred, some rising from their seats to peer out into the darkness, others too exhausted or frightened to move, merely lifting their heads in response. Carl, ever cautious, tempered their rising hopes with a dose of reality. "Stay back from the windows until we know who it is," he instructed firmly, moving towards the driver's seat to get a better view. "It could be help, but we can't be sure yet." The vehicle, a rugged, all-terrain truck, pulled up alongside the bus, its bright headlights momentarily blinding those looking out. The truck was marked with the logo of the local sheriff's department, a sight that brought almost palpable relief. The door of the truck opened, and a figure stepped out, shining a powerful flashlight towards the bus. "It's the sheriff's deputies," someone cried out, recognition sparking further relief among the group. Deputy Ramirez, a well-known figure to the community, approached the bus, his flashlight sweeping the area as he walked. He rapped on the door, his voice muffled through the glass. "Everyone okay in there?" Carl hastened to open the door, and a cold gust of morning air entered the bus. "We've had a rough night, Deputy," he explained quickly. "We need medical attention, and one of our teachers, Mr. Harrow, he went out to distract something, some creature, and hasn't come back." Deputy Ramirez's expression turned grave. "We received your distress call and came as quickly as we could. We'll start a search for Mr. Harrow immediately. Let's get everyone safe and accounted for first." His voice was calm, a practiced reassurance that helped to steady the nerves of the weary students. One by one, the students began to disembark from the bus, their movements sluggish, their faces etched with the trauma of the night's events. Lucas was among the last to exit, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Mr. Harrow, his heart heavy with worry. As the students gathered beside the bus, Deputy Ramirez coordinated with his team over the radio, calling in additional support and medical assistance. Emergency medical technicians, EMTs, arrived shortly, attending to the students, checking for injuries, and offering comfort where they could. Lucas approached Deputy Ramirez, who was overseeing the operation. "Can we do anything to help find Mr. Harrow?" he asked, his voice tense with concern. "We've got teams on it, son," Ramirez replied, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll do everything we can to find him. You've been through a lot. Let us take it from here." As dawn broke fully, casting a soft light over the desert, the reality of their ordeal became even more apparent. The bus sat isolated on the road, surrounded by vast stretches of empty land. It was a miracle the students had survived the night with their sanity intact. Lucas walked a short distance away from the group, needing a moment to himself. He looked out at the rising sun, the beauty of the dawn a stark contrast to the darkness of the previous night. He thought of Mia, of Mr. Harrow, and of the unimaginable creature that had terrorized them. A mix of emotions churned within him, relief at being safe, grief for what had been lost, and a deep, unshakable feeling of uncertainty about what had really happened out in the desert. The rescue operation continued around him, but Lucas felt disconnected from it all, his thoughts lingering on the horror and the heroism of the night. As he stood there, the first rays of sunlight warming his face, he made a silent vow to ensure that the events were not forgotten, that the bravery of his teacher and the memory of his friend were honored. Back at the bus, as the students were being cared for and statements taken, everyone knew that their return to normalcy would be a long road. The desert had changed them, and the shadows of the night would linger in their minds for years to come. But for now, they were safe, and that was what mattered. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the desert landscape and illuminating the bus in a harsh, unforgiving light. The ordeal of the night had left its mark on every face. The students sat wrapped in blankets provided by the EMTs, their expressions a mixture of relief and vacant shock as they processed the night's horrors. Lucas sat apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the desert. He replayed each moment of the night over in his mind, trying to find some logic or reason in the chaos. The image of Mr. Harrow, determined and brave as he walked into the darkness, haunted him. He wondered about the fate of his teacher, about the courage it took to face the unknown for the sake of others. Deputy Ramirez approached Lucas, his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect and gravity. "We found no sign of Mr. Harrow yet," he said softly, the morning breeze carrying his words. "But we found tracks, strange ones, deeper into the desert. We're following them now. We're not giving up." Lucas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Deputy," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt a mixture of hope and dread, knowing the search was still ongoing, that there was still a chance. Around him, the other students began to board another bus that had been brought to take them back to town. The community had rallied quickly, parents and neighbors arriving at the scene as soon as they heard the news, their faces etched with concern and relief as they embraced their children. Sophie came up to Lucas, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "We should tell everyone what happened," she said, her voice firm. "About Mr. Harrow, about Mia, about that thing. People should know." Lucas looked at her, seeing the resolve in her eyes, and he knew she was right. "We will," he agreed. "We'll make sure nobody forgets." The ride back to town was quiet, the bus filled with the soft murmur of conversations and the occasional sob. The landscape passed by, a blur of browns and greens, so normal and yet so alien now to those who had seen the darkness that lay beyond. Upon arrival, the school was a scene of quiet chaos. Reporters crowded the front gates, their cameras flashing as they tried to capture the faces of the survivors. Parents hugged their children, crying openly as they held them close. Lucas, Sophie, and several others were ushered into the school for debriefing. They sat in a small room, the walls lined with school banners and trophies, a stark contrast to the stark reality they had just faced. One by one, they shared their stories with the authorities, their accounts met with nods and notes. But when it came to describing the creature, the questions became more pointed, the skepticism more apparent. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear?" It was dark, after all, one of the officers suggested, trying to rationalize the inexplicable. Lucas shook his head, frustration mounting. It wasn't a bear. We know what we saw, he insisted. The others backed him up, their own stories corroborating his. The official report, when it was finally released, mentioned an animal attack and praised the bravery of the teacher who had risked, and possibly lost, his life to protect his students. The specifics were vague, the creature described ambiguously enough to sow doubt. But for Lucas and the others, the reality was not so easily dismissed. They knew the truth of what they had faced, and they were determined to make sure it was not forgotten. In the weeks that followed, they organized gatherings, spoke at community meetings, and even started an online campaign to keep the story alive. Lucas found solace in his photography, his images capturing the stark beauty of the desert, the resilience of his friends, and the somber memory of those they had lost. He published them alongside their story, a testament to their ordeal, a tribute to Mia and Mr. Harrow. The desert remained, timeless and unchanged, a silent witness to the night of terror. But for those who had survived, the landscape was forever altered. They carried the memory with them, a reminder of the night when the darkness was alive, when bravery and fear met in the heart of the desert.